Morrow Grant at Lexington Theological Seminary. In addition, he is an affiliate faculty there at the seminary, teaching in areas of church history and mission. He has over a decade of international experience serving in South Africa and Mozambique with global ministries, and in South Africa, Lesotho, as Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, with the Mennonite Central Committee. He's originally from Charlotte, North Carolina. He's a personal friend and former colleague of Brandon. So it's my pleasure to introduce Reverend Dr. John Barnes.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
I'm glad you explained the hats, because I thought this is where people put their hats when they came to breakfast. I went and saw the sign of hats, I'm like, that's the most interesting thing I've ever seen. People come in and just line up on it.
If you did that, that's what would happen.
Why you don't retake your hat. Thank you all for allowing me to be here. I'm honored. Thank you, Brandon, for inviting me to do this and to be amongst you and have some breakfast. Thanks for the cooks, everybody who put the breakfast together. I'm very appreciative. I usually eat a bowl of cereal in the morning. I'm used to having potatoes and sausage and all that. So thank you very much. Can you all hear me fine?
Yes.
Okay.
Might get a little close.
All right. Brandon has sent me a few questions I think are fairly typical for this type of meeting, of things to share. And I thought I'd share a bit about that. And I'll also share a little bit at the end about LCS and some things that are going on now that may be of interest, and then can answer questions if that's helpful. So the first question, who has had the most influence on your life? The man who has had the most influence on your life. That would be Reverend Mike Hensley. He's a pastor in South Carolina. Somewhere in college, probably between my freshman and sophomore years, I think, I went to Spartanburg, South Carolina to be a youth intern. Confession, I grew up Southern Baptist. Somewhere around college, I decided I couldn't do that anymore. And I wasn't sure, I didn't know much about other more open-minded, progressive understandings of faith. And so I knew I couldn't do that anymore, but I wasn't sure what was going to come. And found the Disciples. That's a different story. I've been with Disciples for over 2 decades now, ordained for over 2 decades. So Mike Hensley was the associate minister, and I worked with him. He was someone who helped me think through some of those things. He was Baptist, still is Baptist, has served in Baptist churches his whole life. But he was someone who told me early on, please don't check your brain at the door of the church. You need to bring your intellect with you and think and question and wonder and ponder. And he also told me you have to be comfortable with mystery. Because the church at that point in the 90s was moving towards a much more conservative, fundamentalist understanding where we have all the answers and we know with certainty. And he said, well, we're talking about the ineffable God that we serve, certainty is something that we're not going to have. And so that set me up as a young person still in college to enter things in a different frame of mind and to be comfortable with mystery and to allow some of the other things that would then happen. I probably was able to receive them in a different way because of his mentorship and relationship. He was also Dawn, my wife. He was her youth minister when she was growing up. So he performed our wedding. He spoke at both of our ordination services. He's been a mentor. Anytime I've had a major life decision to make, he's who I call. One of the people that I call. And he's now in his late 70s, and I found out about a month ago, he's been undergoing cancer treatments for a few years, and they thought they had beat it, but about a month ago, he entered hospice care. Dawn and I, as his family, has struggled with that. Trying to be there to support him in every way we can. He's been a father figure for me. So, Mike Hensley in Spartanburg. Tell us about a particularly difficult time in your life, and how did your faith sustain you? It was probably the most difficult time in my life. November 2015 is when it began. My wife and I were serving in Pietermaritzburg, South Africa. I'm a long distance, I've been a runner for years, marathons and all of that. And I was actually in the process of training for an ultra marathon that's, if you're South African or if you're in South Africa, it's fairly well known, called Comrades. And I was in the process of training for that. And I started having issues breathing. Just noticed I couldn't catch my breath, which is weird because I was in my mid-40s and been running for years. But I'm a guy and I'm dumb, and so I was like, it's fine. And then I started having this really bad pain in my calf, but I was running about 50 or 60 miles a week, and I was like, pull something, it's fine. And then on a Saturday, I was out with my family, and all of a sudden, couldn't breathe. And my wife rushed me to a clinic, and they gave me some tablets, blood thinning tablets, and so when we got there, Dawn says that my face was turning white, my lips were turning blue, and I honestly thought, I said, I'm not going to see my kids again, because I thought that was it. And it turned out that I had a blood clot in my calf and a pulmonary embolism, and when they did the scan, I had 14 embolisms, 14 clots that passed through, and that happened to be the one that sent me to the hospital. So all of that's why I had trouble breathing. So anyway, that was coming that close to death. When you're training for an ultra marathon and you're healthy and everything's going well, and you think life is clicking along, and you come that close to the end of things, that sort of recalibrates and helps you check some things. I also, it's funny, let's talk about having grown up, maybe that's funny, maybe interesting. Having grown up Southern Baptist, I'm very comfortable with mystery, but I promise you, when I was laying on that table and I couldn't breathe, some certainty would have been quite nice. And so I felt myself defaulting to some old things in the moment. And I wasn't quite sure what to do with that. I'm like, I teach this stuff. But in the midst of going through a very life-changing event, I had to ask myself, well, what is it that I stand on? What is it that's core to who I am in my faith? And so through some counseling, some other things, I was able to reconnect with the apophatic tradition within our faith, the tradition that embraces mystery and says that we can say these things about God. We can say that God is love, but God is much more unlike my understanding of love than like my understanding of love. God is like a rock, but much more unlike my understanding of a rock than like my understanding of a rock. And we can get all philosophical, but basically the understanding that whatever words I come up with, and we have to have words. We have to be able to describe what it is that we believe. We also have to have the humility to understand that we don't know a whole lot. I had a professor when I was in seminary. In fact, some of you may know him because I think he has some Lexington connections. He passed away recently, Glenn Henson. He taught at Baptist Theological Seminary of Kentucky when it was LTS was sort of hosting them, and then moved to Louisville. But I remember once, that's a lesson I'll never forget. I don't remember a ton of lessons from specific seminary classes because it was a long time ago, but this one lesson stuck with me. We were sitting in the classroom, and there was a long whiteboard in the front of the classroom, and he taught spirituality and mysticism in seminary. And so he went up to this whiteboard, and he drew a small, tiny little square from where we were sitting. It looked like a dot. And he said, imagine that this whiteboard is God in all God's totality. That square is how much you understand. So before you say, thus says the Lord, because he's training a whole bunch of future ministers and people serving as clergy. Before you say, thus says the Lord, have a little humility. And understand that God's capacity to love and to forgive, God's capacity for grace, is bigger than your understanding of God's love and God's forgiveness and God's capacity for grace. And so I wish when I was 45 down on a table, I may pay more attention to Dr. Henson in those classes. I may have some different resources to draw from. But it did turn me back to those resources. I was familiar with them. And since that time, contemplation has become a time of contemplation each day has become more important in my life, a time of centering prayer. With the hectic schedule that sometimes life gives us, it's hard sometimes, but I try to do 20 minutes in the morning of centering, and that's helpful. And I try to, it's been interesting. I teach mission at the seminary, and when we think about God's mission in the world and missionary work, that work has been done with a certain amount of certainty about who's going and what they have to share. And so when I teach those classes now, I try to bring in an apathetic understanding of, when we go and share our faith, that's fine, but let's have some humility too, because we're going to have something to learn along the way. So that's probably, yeah, I would say that's the most difficult time. I actually had, last year, I was running one day and I felt the same thing. I hadn't felt it in 9 years, and I thought, oh crap. I thought this was sorted out. And they went to the ER, and I ended up having a clot in my abdomen that was 8 inches long. And I had something called, I can't remember the name of the syndrome. Anyway, it'll come back to me. Probably when I finish this in a week, it'll come back to me. It doesn't matter. But it's where your artery and veins press on each other. And so they finally figured out what was causing the clotting. And I had a surgery about just over a year ago to insert two stents into a vein. And ever since then, it's all good. And the surgeon said, you should be good from now till something else gets you. So that won't be it. So anyway, so I feel I'm in a much better space. Let's see. What was the third question? Do I remember? I have it on my sheet.
Were you most thankful for? Was that something like that? Is that right?
Yeah, I had my sheet. I think it's something got deleted. I had my sheet notes over here.
Yeah.
And
I think it's what are you most thankful for?
I never got LTS.
Well, I can ask a question, Albert.
Yeah, sure.
So you were doing missionary work in South Africa.
Yeah.
What was the most amazing thing or the thing that strikes you the most about that experience being a missionary? During apartheid?
No, apartheid ended in '94 with Nelson Mandela's election, and we arrived in 2002. Although, when we think about racism and separation here based on difference, only 8 years after apartheid, it was still very much ingrained in the culture, obviously. We work primarily with Black African pastors, and I remember we were staying with a family in a township, and the pastor looked at me and said, just a few years ago, it would have been illegal for me to host you in my home. You couldn't have been here, and I couldn't have been in your house. One of the things I take away, there's lots, but there's one of the key things that comes off the top of my head, is just the incredible diversity and beauty of faith around the world. If you were to worship with a church in South Africa, and they were speaking Zulu or Xhosa or Tswana or indigenous language, there's certain things you would recognize, the community table and that's the sermon. I mean, there would be things we would recognize, but there are aspects to worship that would be just as foreign to a Westerner as if we were at a synagogue or a mosque. And so that's one of the things that I found fascinating, was all the various different ways of worship and service in different cultures. One of the things too, living in a pluralistic culture, we're pluralistic here, but in South Africa, because of its history, and the British did a very good job of moving people around their colonies. There's lots of people of Indian descent, many who are Hindu or Muslims, and so almost everybody we knew and worked with, their cousin went to the mosque. They had an auntie who went to the temple, and when it was Diwali, everybody went and celebrated. When it was Ramadan, everybody went and broke the fast together. When it was Easter, Muslims came to the church and celebrated with their cousins. And I found that incredibly hopeful as well, that there could be those kinds of relationships and that kind of give and take and respect. Because nobody was trying to convert anybody, they were family, and they respected and celebrated each other's religions and cultures. So I would say that.
Would you say they were more passionate as well? About the faith,
Yeah, for sure. And I do think, especially in the the Southern African context, because we worked in the churches. I mean, one of the things that's happened is Christianity has become the predominant faith in many countries in Southern Africa. The faith has been contextualized in a way that makes sense. The faith that Westerners brought, that the Western missionaries, whether from the UK or the US or wherever, answered questions that those cultures asked, if that makes sense. And Africans have had to reframe faith in a way that answers the cultures that their cultures, reframe the questions so that they answer the questions that that culture asked. I mean, one of the fascinating things that happened, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds. I mean, I can talk about this all day because I find it fascinating. But when they translated the Bible into say Xhosa or Zulu, they used indigenous names for God. You know, there is this great spirit. What do you call him? Well, we call him Nkulunkulu, which means the greatest of the great. If something is Nkulu, it's great. Nkulunkulu is the greatest of the great. Well, when that happens, and I think I shared this that morning when we had the thing about the Ghana trip at El Tiesto. When that happens, that God gets baptized into Christianity, but Christianity gets baptized into the beliefs of that indigenous culture as well. There's a crossover and a mutual sharing of beliefs, which then helps people are not being introduced to a foreign God. This is the God that they know, just in a different light, which alters Christianity, but also alters the indigenous faith. And I just find that process fascinating. And so, yeah, people are very passionate about their faith. One of the other things that I would say is it's a much more communal faith. In the U.S., we just are so, in general, we're very individualistic in many ways, not just faith, but in many ways. And there's a much more, just a stronger sense of community there because it's a much more communal culture. We're in this together. In fact, I had a South African pastor say this whole thing about are you saved, are you saved, are you saved doesn't make sense in our context because we do this together. It's just a very different way of approaching it.
So is the established church there experiencing the same challenges that the church is experiencing here in terms of demise and loss of participants and the like?
Kind of repeat the question, so.
Sure. Asking if the churches there are experiencing the same kind of sociological issues here as far as loss of membership, loss of participation, those types of things. Is that fair?
That's fair. And the reason I ask it is because of the passion element
Right.
and I'm not familiar with
Sure.
churches there, but I am familiar with the evangelical movement within the Puerto Rican community.
Right.
To the extent that that's still there. It appears to be strong because we're getting reinforcements from the Dominicans,
Sure.
the Costa Ricans, and what have you.
Sure.
So I don't know whether in Africa or other cultures, their experience seems to me like they're growing, but I don't know.
Yeah. Africa has the fastest rate of growth of Christianity in the world. There's more Christians on the continent of Africa than any other continent in the world. That happened a few years ago. And so, yeah, the churches are growing. Now, if you go to a white South African Presbyterian church in Johannesburg, they would probably have some of the same issues that mainline churches here are dealing with. But in general, it's just looking at numbers overall. Christianity in South Africa is growing, Christianity in Africa is growing. That's when we took our LTS group trip last October to Ghana, that was one of the things that we wanted to witness and see was this exponential growth of Christianity in Africa. And a lot of that is happening due to the fact that in many places, Christianity has been thoroughly contextualized, I guess, to say. It makes sense in the culture. It's not a missionary religion anymore. It's a Ghanaian Christianity, it's South African Christianity. And so during the 60s, 70s, 80s, there could be this, well, if you're a Christian, then you've taken on the religion of the colonizer, of the oppressor, or whatever. And that's not even a discussion anymore because it's a very thoroughly lived out phase within that context. So, yeah, I think it's, if I remember the numbers correctly, in 1910, which is that that date because that was a famous missionary conference that took place in Edinburgh, Scotland. They estimate there are around 10 million Christians on the continent of Africa, on the whole continent, 10 million. Today, there's somewhere around between 650 and 700 million Christians, a century later. From 10 million to 650 to 700 million in just over a century. So that's pretty exponential growth.
And that as we participate in the congregations.
Yeah. We went to a church, it was Presbyterian in Ghana, and they're still building the church. It has a roof, but there's no walls or anything. They're just worshiping there while they're building it, because they outgrew their old space. And while we were worshiping, you could hear the Apostolic Church down the road, and then over there the Catholics, it's all charismatic can have a certain understanding here in the U.S., but it's all charismatic in the sense of spirit-filled, even the Catholic Church. There's dancing, singing, it's very joyful worship. It's a lot of fun, actually, if you're not used to it, so, yeah.
How are the ministers trained in South Africa?
Yeah, well, it depends on which church body they belong to. We worked with the United Congregational Church of Southern Africa, which came out of Congregationalist missionaries from the U.S. and from the U.K. In the 1800s. And so, yeah, they have seminaries. They have theological training schools, kind of like ours. There's some that are affiliated with the Congregational Church, but if they want to go to a one that's not, that's fine too. So in some ways there's similarities, but yeah, you get your bachelor's degree and you get your master's degree. I would say the disciples' history, it's been an MDiv, it's sort of in the credential to get ordained, and those things are changing somewhat as we move forward. But there is definitely, yes, they have seminary education, and there's a certain threshold. They also have what they call vocational groups there, which I found interesting. So they take all the students who are congregational students and they form these groups, even if they're in different schools, and they meet together twice a year to talk about calling, vocation, and support one another. And also building a sense of camaraderie and relationships amongst students so that when they become ministers, they'll continue to have these relationships going forward. And so Dawn and I got to participate in some of those groups and help mentor students, which was just such a gift. So, yeah.
With that many Christians, is there a shortage of ministers? Are they hungry for people?
Yes, there is a shortage of ministers. Well, one of the things that's happened, especially with the churches that came from the historic missionary churches like the Congregationalists and Methodist Presbyterians, you have one missionary who had a mission station, and then they would create these mission sort of outposts in all these surrounding villages. Well, that still exists. So you have the mother church, which is usually where the pastor lives at the parsonage or whatever. But I mean, one of the pastors we worked with had the mother church and 19, they call them outstations. But each outstation is its own church. So he was the pastor of 20 churches. He had the mother church and all the outstations that still related to that. So if you said, well, how many members are a part of your church? He would include all the outstations, and he would say, oh, I've got 9,000 members. But they were 20 different churches, 800 here, 300 here, whatever, all added up. They could probably use some help. Because many of the churches would be, to use the terminology we use here, would be viable. I mean, if you have 400 members in a rural village, that church could have its own ministry. It could support its own ministry. But there's these historic ties, and nobody wants to. They're very proud that we're an outstation for that mother church. At least my experience was the people that I knew were very proud of that history and wanted to continue. So, yeah. Sorry, I forgot the third question, but we had a good discussion. If y'all have any questions about LTS, I'm happy to answer anything about that as well.
How do you compare the learning experience online within class? Have you had experience with
Yeah, for sure. I teach online asynchronous classes, and I'll be honest, I came to the asynchronous teaching, and asynchronous meaning like you're never online at the same time, and with the students. And I came to that very ambivalent, because I grew up in a more traditional education model where I was a residential student, and Yeah, so I came to it very ambivalent, but it works for a number of reasons. The days of students moving, their families, our average age is 49 to 50 is the average age of our students. And so if you're 48 and you got 3 teenagers and a spouse that has a job and you live somewhere, if you feel a calling to ministry, you may not be at a place where you can pick up and move to LTS or Bright or wherever you want to study. That's just not feasible. And so I think that it does offer students an opportunity to pursue vocation and calling in a way that opens doors. So I do appreciate that. And I do think, it's funny, I do think that model works. Because we also teach intensives on campus twice a year. And the first time I taught intensives, students who had never physically met each other were hugging each other and like they were best friends because they had been in so many classes together asynchronously. And so you've got your assignments, you've got video lectures to watch, but we do try to create as much interaction as possible through discussion posts and different ways of students actually interacting with each other and with whoever's teaching. And also I think, I'm doing an asynchronous class right now. I'm a student in a class right now that the Association of Theological Schools is doing on artificial intelligence and theological education, which we can have a whole another long breakfast on that. And I'm enjoying it, but I feel a disconnect. But I didn't grow up with that. Especially our younger students, if the students are 35 or younger, their social media, they grew up in a completely different way than I did. I'm 54 years old. And so they don't feel a disconnect. They can feel they have no problem having a virtual online community, and then when they get together, it just carries on. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. We try to create as much of the in-class experience as possible as we can, but I think there's drawbacks to both ways of doing it, but there's positives as well.
Typically, how many times a year would they meet in person?
Twice, yeah. We have intensives in January and June. The 2 times students on campus.
I grew up, with the time my dad was on the board of LTS in the big, nice building down there. And that was my sense of what a seminary should be.
Sure.
And then, so I was really troubled by the move away from that into the office building.
Right.
But then I ran into a bunch of women who said particularly when it was a second career opportunity, that the new system really made it possible for them as a second career with children and others to go to seminary where they couldn't have done it before.
Yeah.
I guess we brought a lot of women in that we wouldn't have brought in before.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely, yeah. There's a lot of difference that maybe wouldn't be present in our classroom spaces because of that. And I will say, you all know better than I do, those of you who are in Lexington, all that LTS went through a while back and where we are now. And we've got over 150 students registered and taking classes. We have 2 new master's programs, one in African American Studies and one in Latinx Studies that just launched this past fall, and the second cohort will start this coming fall. Our doctoral program now has almost 40 students in it, our DN program. The seminary is in a very, very good space, both for students and finances. I don't get paid to do this, but the leadership of President Gillette and getting the seminary through and taking it to where it is now has just been incredible.
Some of us started out with the College of the Bible.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Yes. Yeah, for sure. So, yeah.
Until recently, I was taking courses there. In my experience as a student, I felt there was more interaction between students than I experienced sitting in a classroom with other students.
Yeah, I will say, like a student who's introverted, sitting in a classroom space may not feel as open to share, but on a discussion post, when I have time to think about it and I digest things and I can type, and it does open up. I found the discussions much richer than sometimes spur of the moment what happens in the classroom. Although I do miss sitting in a room looking at human. When I do teach in intensives, I come out very tired because it's a full day of teaching. You start at 8:30 in the morning and go till 5. So by the end of the day, you're worn out. But I come out energized because it's just a different vibe being in a room with humans. So yeah.
know that everybody in the room will not agree with me, but I'm wearing black today because I'm kind of in mourning over our current administration. Is the seminary dealing with the kinds of issues, the challenge to democracy and other kinds of things? Is that something that you can deal with in the seminary these days to help people be prepared going into communities with the kinds of troubling issues that are facing us today?
Yeah, absolutely, that's a great question. First of all, I'll say that LTS, our first strategic imperative, which was passed by the board 5 years ago and just renewed for another 5 years as our first strategic imperative, is diversity, equity, and inclusion. I don't know if DEI is, if you've come across that term in our media lately, but,
Trump will be after you.
what's that?
Trump will be after you.
Yeah, well, yes, we've had some discussions about that, but, I have to be honest, in one sense, we're in a different place than, say, UK would be, because we don't get any federal. There's not something we can be punished with financially in that way, that a lot of major universities, state and private, they get federal funds. That's a pretty powerful stick, and I get that. But we've also said that, well, first of all, we define DEI in many different ways. It's also the rural student from Eastern Kentucky. It's the first generation student. There's many ways to understand having diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not simply looking at a race, a gender, a whatever. It's all of it. We also know that we do realize we're training students to work in purple churches, in churches that have people of all different political persuasions, which has always been the case, but we're just in a different place right now into what that looks like. And so I think about Leah Shea. Dr. Shea teaches a class on preaching in the purple zone. She has a book entitled Preaching in the Purple Zone. I think all of us are very cognizant of the places our students serve. And in one sense, I think we try to support them in every way we can, just as the kind of support I had as a student when I was going through seminary on a personal level, try to support and encourage them, but also hopefully try to give them the tools to help their congregation ask hard questions and not come up with easy answers. And in asking the questions, maybe have a little grace for somebody on the other side. And I hope that happens along the way. I think it's becoming, it is harder and harder to do, as we're seeing in our time and culture. But disciple churches especially are places where I just share this quick. I know I don't be here all day, but I had to preach, a year and a half ago in Maysville. I was living in Indy at the time. We hadn't moved to Nicholasville. So I was driving down, I went through Cincinnati, and I took some highway that sort of follows the border. And anyway, I ended up in Maysville, and I'm driving down. It was just a month or so before the election here in Kentucky where Beshear was reelected. So there were signs, there was these houses with Trump signs and Beshear signs in the same yard. And I'm not from here, and I was like, what? And so I was trying to figure out how that works. So I was staying with a family in the church. And I didn't ask this question right off the bat, but I waited, after an hour sitting there and chatting, and I felt, okay, there's a certain comfort level now. And I said, I'm not trying to get political or get in a debate. I'm just trying to understand what's happening. And I explained it. And the gentleman that was hosting, he said, you remember the floods we had last year? And I said, yeah, I remember reading about them. He said, Andy Beshear was here for us. So he said, that's where that's coming from, is that politics is local. And yes, we have our, whatever, people will be voting for Trump, some will vote for the other side, whatever. But for many of us, because he was here and took care of us, that's what matters. And it actually gave me a bit of hope, that everything isn't so ideologically aligned that we can't even think about the possibility of seeing the humanity and the care that someone from an opposing party can give. So, I came away from that conversation thinking, maybe there's a bit of hope. So, yeah.
Is there anywhere in theological education that they're talking about membership and evangelism and how you do it? I know they're preaching the faith and all those good things, but we've got this big issue of demographics in the church that I can't find anybody that's addressing it.
Yeah, for sure. I think membership is, before we moved here, my wife and I were members of Central Christian in Indianapolis. And I worked with we had lots of millennial couples and singles coming to the church, because they didn't know anything about disciples, they just loved Central. But when it came time to join, like the whole idea of walking down front, and they were like, why do I come every Sunday? I'm here, I'm a member, why do I have to do this? So part of it, I think, is a mind shift for us as churches, is, well, what does that look like? There's been a way that we've counted members, and you can serve as a deacon, but you can't serve as, there's all these different ways because of the hoops that people have, I didn't have a problem joining. When Dawn and I decided to join the church here, I had no trouble going up to the front and meeting with the minister and doing that. But anybody 35 and below, they were all had the same kind of thing. So part of the demographic piece too, and I'm not trying to dodge the question at all, but part of it is I think people are still committed and want community. They just envision it in a different way. In fact, I would say that some of those folks, we used to meet, we did theology on tap, we'd meet at a pub downtown and have a beer and talk about theology. For them, that was church. And they consider themselves members of what we were doing.
We only got about 1% of the congregations that attend regularly, that's every week.
Right.
30% will say they attend regularly, they might be there once a month.
Sure.
So our sanctuary is less than a third full.
Right.
A third full on Sunday.
Sure.
As a businessman, I'm saying you're wasting 2/3 of your assets.
Right. Yeah, well, I don't have an answer for that one. If I did, I'd write a book and make a whole bunch of money, actually. Yeah, I mean, I think that, that church has to, there's cultural reasons for this, but there's also, I think church also has to reinvent itself and rethink along the way of what it means to be church and how we count those numbers and what involvement means and all those things.
And I think theological education also has a role
Yes.
of teaching in the institutions what techniques, what works best,
Yeah.
how do we do this thing called evangelism.
For sure. Well, and I know with what I teach, because I teach in mission, and I teach mission classes, and a lot of what we talk about is building human relationships and engagement. I grew up Southern Baptist, so it was a matter of, do you believe this, do you believe that, good, you're on the good side, if not, we don't do that. But it's about building relationships and involvement, and what involvement means can be different on the context. And then there's an evolution to those relationships that leads to things. I still believe in the Spirit, and I still believe the Spirit can move in ways that we don't see all the time, and you definitely can't program. And that's built on human-centered relationships. So I don't think there's a silver bullet to take care of any of this. But at Central and Indy, it's a growing downtown church. And I can't remember the numbers, but we had to move to two, before COVID, we had to move to 2 services because the sanctuary wouldn't hold everybody for one. And so people would come in, what are you doing? And Linda McCrae, who was the pastor there, and she was like, I don't know, we preach justice, we love people, and we serve.
Well, it's not a Protestant issue either.
Right.
I have a good friend that serves on a council in Pittsburgh with the Archbishop. And he's been there 25 years, the guy that served on the council 25 years. And they have gone from 300 parishes in the Pittsburgh district to 100 parishes in 25 years.
Yeah, right.
So they have tremendous shrinkage.
Yeah.
They just can't support that with their physical location.
And one thing to say too, and I'll be done, when we think about Christianity in the U.S., we tend to think about our own kind of circumstances, but you can go down the street, I don't know, I'm still learning Lexington, but I'd be pretty positive to say within a few miles of where we're sitting today, you could worship with Ghanaians, you could worship with Chinese, you could worship with other communities, and those communities tend to be growing in our context. And so I do think there's ways, not that we can reproduce what they're doing, but I think building relationships, it used to be, if I wanted to worship with Ghanaians, I had to get on a plane and go to Ghana, and now that's not the case anymore. And I do think there can be real power in building relationships locally, cross-culturally with other people of faith, and growing those relationships and see what that leads to as well. Not simply to grow membership or whatever, but just to grow relationships and see how God uses that. I think that can be a really powerful testimony.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Next month, I understand we have a problem with availability of cooks